Sarah Mitchell had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost her everything. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled any room she entered. Her dark brown eyes held a determination that had carried her through 12 years of military service, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected intelligence officers in her unit. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday at the forward operating base in Afghanistan. Sarah reviewed classified reports while sipping her third cup of coffee, the bitter taste mixing with the dust that seemed to coat everything in this desert outpost. She had been stationed here for 8 months, working closely with local Afghan interpreters and intelligence sources to gather crucial information about insurgent activities in the region. Her specialty was human intelligence, building relationships with local contacts who trusted her enough to share vital information. Sarah spoke fluent Pashto and had spent years learning the cultural nuances that made her so effective. The Afghan people she worked with respected her because she respected them. She never made promises she couldn't keep, and she always protected her sources. That Tuesday morning, Sarah received an urgent message to report to Colonel Harrison's office immediately. She found it strange because Harrison wasn't her direct superior, and she rarely had contact with him. As she walked across the dusty compound, she noticed more security personnel than usual, and the atmosphere felt tense. Colonel Harrison was a tall, stern man in his 50s with gray hair and cold blue eyes. When Sarah entered his office, she found him sitting behind his desk with 2 men in civilian clothes she didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits that looked out of place in the military environment, and their faces were expressionless. "Officer Mitchell," Harrison began without any pleasantries, "these gentlemen are from a government agency that requires your cooperation on a matter of national security." One of the civilians, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, opened a thick file folder. "We need you to provide us with the names and locations of all your Afghan contacts and sources," he said in a flat, bureaucratic tone. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Sir, I can't do that. Those people trusted me with their lives. If their identities are compromised, they and their families will be killed." The second civilian, younger with sharp features, leaned forward. "This is not a request, Officer Mitchell. This is a direct order related to a classified operation that supersedes your normal protocols." "I need to see proper authorization," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her growing alarm. "And I need to understand how this information will be used and how these people will be protected." Harrison's face darkened. "You don't need to understand anything except that you're being given a direct order by your superiors." Sarah took a deep breath. She had sworn an oath when she joined the military, promising to protect innocent lives and uphold the values of her country. But she had also made personal promises to the Afghan people, who had risked everything to help her mission. Some of them had become more than sources. They had become friends. "Sir, with respect, I cannot provide that information without proper safeguards in place for these individuals and their families." The room fell silent. The 2 civilians exchanged glances, and Harrison's jaw tightened. "Officer Mitchell, you are refusing a direct order." "I am requesting proper procedures be followed to protect innocent lives," Sarah corrected. The younger civilian closed his folder with a sharp snap. Perhaps Officer Mitchell needs time to reconsider her position. Time to think about her career, her future, and the consequences of obstructing a national security operation. Over the next hour, they applied increasing pressure. They threatened her military career, her pension, even criminal charges. They told her that her refusal was tantamount to treason, that she was putting American lives at risk. But they never explained how her sources would be protected or why the information was needed. Sarah thought about Fareed, an elderly shopkeeper who had provided crucial intelligence about weapons smuggling routes. He had 7 grandchildren and had already been threatened by insurgents who suspected he was helping Americans. She thought about Amira, a teacher who had shared information about insurgent recruitment in schools, risking her life because she believed education was the path to peace. "I cannot and will not betray the trust of people who have risked everything to help our mission," Sarah said finally. "If you can provide proper assurances about their safety and legal authorization for this request, I will cooperate. Until then, my answer is no." The atmosphere in the room became icy. Harrison stood up slowly, his face red with anger. "Officer Mitchell, you are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. You will be confined to quarters until further notice. As military police escorted her from the office, Sarah felt her world crumbling around her. She had dedicated her adult life to serving her country, and now she was being treated like a traitor for trying to protect innocent people. The other soldiers in the compound stared as she was led away, confusion and concern evident on their faces. Her small quarters felt like a prison cell as she waited, not knowing what would happen next. She had no access to communication, no way to contact anyone for help. All she could do was sit on her narrow cot and wonder if she had made the right choice. That night, lying in the darkness and listening to the distant sounds of the base, Sarah thought about her oath. She had promised to defend her country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But what happened when the greatest threat seemed to come from within? What happened when doing the right thing meant defying the very institution she had sworn to serve? As the hours passed, Sarah's resolve only strengthened. She would rather face whatever consequences awaited her than live with the knowledge that she had betrayed innocent people who had trusted her. 3 days after her confinement began, Sarah heard the heavy footsteps approaching her quarters before dawn. The door opened with a metallic clang, and 4 military police officers entered, their faces grim and professional. The sergeant in charge held a pair of heavy steel shackles. "Ma'am, we have orders to transfer you to a secure facility for continued questioning," he said, avoiding eye contact. Sarah could see the discomfort in his posture. These were soldiers who had served alongside her, and now they were forced to treat her like a criminal. The shackles were cold and heavier than she had expected. They locked around her wrists with a finality that made her heart race. As they led her from the quarters she had called home for 8 months, Sarah caught glimpses of her fellow soldiers watching from windows and doorways. Some looked away in shame, others stared with confusion and concern. The transport truck bounced violently over the rough desert roads, each jolt sending sharp pains through Sarah's shoulders as the shackles cut into her wrists. She was taken to a facility 2 hours away, a place she had never seen before despite her years of service in the region. It was a stark concrete building surrounded by high walls and razor wire, designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners. Her new cell was 6 feet by 8 feet, containing only a metal cot with a thin mattress, a small sink, and a toilet. The walls were painted an institutional gray that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the small window near the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of guards walking the corridors and the occasional slam of heavy doors. For the first week, they left her completely alone. No visitors, no questions, no communication of any kind. The isolation was a deliberate psychological tactic designed to break down her resistance and make her desperate for any human contact. Meals arrived through a slot in the door twice a day. Tasteless gruel, stale bread, and lukewarm water in a plastic cup. Sarah used the time to exercise, doing push-ups and sit-ups to maintain her physical strength. She recited poetry she had memorized in college, solved mathematical problems in her head, and mentally rehearsed conversations in Pashto to keep her language skills sharp. Anything to prevent her mind from deteriorating in the monotonous environment. The interrogations began on the 8th day. They came for her at different times, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just as she was falling asleep, deliberately disrupting any routine she might establish. The interrogation room was sterile and windowless, with bright fluorescent lights that never dimmed and a metal table bolted to the floor. Her interrogators rotated, but the questions remained the same. They wanted names, addresses, meeting locations, communication methods, and family information for every Afghan contact she had developed over her years of service. They had files thick with photographs and surveillance reports, evidence of just how closely they had been monitoring her work. "We know you met with Ahmad Nazari at the tea shop on Kabul Street every Thursday for 6 months, one interrogator said, sliding a photograph across the table. "We have recordings of your conversations. All we need is confirmation of his family's location." Sarah studied the photograph of Ahmad, a brave man who had provided information about improvised explosive device locations, saving countless American and Afghan lives. "I have nothing to say. They tried different approaches. Sometimes they were aggressive, shouting and threatening. Other times they were sympathetic, claiming they understood her position but needed her help to save American lives. They told her that her sources were already compromised, that cooperating wouldn't put them in any additional danger. "The Taliban already suspects most of these people," a female interrogator explained during one session. "You're not protecting them by staying silent. You're just making it harder for us to extract them safely. But Sarah knew they were lying. If they already had all this information, why did they need her confirmation? If the sources were already blown, why the desperate pressure for details? She had been in intelligence long enough to recognize manipulation tactics. The physical conditions began to wear on her. The cell was either too hot during the day or too cold at night. Sleep was nearly impossible, with guards checking on her every hour, shining flashlights through the door slot. The food was deliberately inadequate, leaving her constantly hungry and weak. After 3 weeks, they introduced new pressures. They showed her fabricated news reports claiming she was being investigated for treason. They brought in fake family members, actors claiming to be her relatives, begging her to cooperate for their sake. They played recordings of what they claimed were her sources being tortured, though Sarah could tell the voices were wrong. The psychological pressure was relentless. They told her that her military career was over, that she would spend decades in prison, that no one cared about her sacrifice. They claimed her fellow soldiers thought she was a traitor, that her family was ashamed of her actions. "You're protecting people who don't even know you exist," one interrogator sneered. "You're throwing away your life for strangers who would sell you out in a heartbeat." But every time Sarah felt her resolve wavering, she remembered faces. Farid's weathered hands as he served her tea and quietly passed along information about insurgent movements. Amira's determined expression as she spoke about her students' futures. Hassan, barely 18, who had risked everything to warn about a planned attack on a school. These weren't just sources or assets. They were human beings who had trusted her with their lives. They had believed in something greater than themselves, just as she did. Betraying them would be betraying everything she had sworn to protect. During her 5th week in confinement, they brought in a military psychiatrist who tried to convince her that her loyalty was misplaced, that she was suffering from a form of Stockholm Syndrome with her sources. He spoke in clinical terms about misguided emotional attachments and the need to prioritize American interests above all else. "You're a good soldier who got too close to the mission," he explained in a condescending tone. "It happens to intelligence officers sometimes, but you need to remember who you really serve." Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "I serve the values my country is supposed to stand for. Honor, integrity, protection of the innocent. If that makes me a traitor, then maybe the problem isn't with me." The nights were the hardest. Alone in her cell, surrounded by concrete and steel, Sarah sometimes wondered if she was being naive. Maybe she was just one person fighting an impossible battle. Maybe her sacrifice would mean nothing in the end. But then she would remember her oath, not just to her country but to herself. She had promised to be someone worthy of the trust placed in her. That promise was stronger than any fear, stronger than any threat they could make. During her 6th week in solitary confinement, Sarah's mind began to drift back to the moments that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The walls of her cell seemed to dissolve as she remembered the day she first raised her right hand and spoke the words that would define her life. She was 19 years old, standing in a recruitment office in small-town Ohio. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the recruiting sergeant, a kind woman with gentle eyes, administered the oath of enlistment. Sarah's voice had trembled slightly as she repeated the ancient words. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same." At the time, those words had felt like a promise to something grand and noble. She had imagined herself serving her country with distinction, protecting freedom and democracy around the world. She had grown up in a family where service mattered. Her grandfather had fought in World War II, her father in Vietnam. The walls of their modest home were decorated with faded photographs of men and women in uniform, people who had sacrificed for ideals larger than themselves. But it wasn't until her 3rd deployment, when she was 25 and working her first intelligence assignment, that Sarah truly understood what her oath meant. She had been stationed in Iraq, working with local interpreters to gather information about insurgent activities. One of her contacts was a young man named Omar, barely older than she was, who worked at a local market and had access to valuable intelligence about weapons caches. Omar had a younger sister named Layla, who was studying to become a doctor. He shared information with Sarah not for money, but because he believed that helping to remove weapons from his neighborhood would make it safer for his sister to attend university. Sarah had promised Omar that his identity would be protected, that his cooperation would never be used in a way that would endanger him or his family. 3 months into their working relationship, Sarah learned that Omar's information had been passed to a different intelligence unit without proper security protocols. Within a week, insurgents had identified Omar as an American collaborator. They kidnapped Layla first, using her as leverage to force Omar to renounce his cooperation and provide false information. Sarah had fought desperately to get approval for a rescue operation, but her superiors deemed it too risky. The bureaucracy moved too slowly, and by the time anyone took action, it was too late. Omar and Layla were found dead in an abandoned building, victims of the very violence Omar had tried to help prevent. Sarah had attended their funeral, standing at the back of the crowded cemetery as their father wept over their graves. She understood then that her oath wasn't just about following orders or serving institutional interests. It was about the sacred trust that people like Omar placed in her. When someone risked their life to help her mission, she became responsible for protecting them in return. That understanding deepened during her years of service. In each deployment, Sarah met brave individuals who chose to work with American forces despite enormous personal risk. There was Khalil, an Iraqi police officer who provided information about corruption in his department, knowing that discovery would mean certain death. Maria, a translator in El Salvador who helped Sarah understand the complex political dynamics that fueled violence in her region. Ahmed, a shopkeeper in Somalia, who allowed American operatives to use his store as a safe meeting place. Each of these people had families, dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. They weren't just intelligence assets or sources to be exploited. They were human beings who had decided to trust Sarah with their lives because they believed in the same ideals she had sworn to defend. Sarah remembered a conversation she had with her mentor, Major Patricia Williams, during her officer training course. Major Williams was a veteran intelligence officer with 20 years of experience, and she had seen how the demands of the job could corrupt even well-intentioned people. The hardest part of this work, Major Williams had told her, isn't dealing with enemies who want to kill you. It's maintaining your integrity when your own side pressures you to compromise your values. There will be times when following orders conflicts with doing what's right. When that happens, you have to remember who you really serve. I serve my country, Sarah had replied, confident in her answer. Major Williams had smiled sadly. Your country is an idea, Sarah. It's the belief that every person has inherent dignity and worth. It's the conviction that power should be used to protect the innocent, not exploit them. When you lose sight of that, when you start treating people as disposable assets, you stop serving your country and start serving something much darker. Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she sat in her cell, reflecting on the choice that had brought her here. The interrogators kept insisting that she owed her loyalty to the institution, to the chain of command, to the mission as defined by her superiors. But Sarah knew that true loyalty meant something deeper. She thought about the Constitution she had sworn to defend. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process, the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection under law. These principles weren't just for American citizens. They were supposed to represent universal values that America stood for around the world. How could she claim to defend these principles while simultaneously betraying people who had risked everything to help uphold them? How could she protect the Constitution by violating the trust that formed the foundation of legitimate intelligence work? Sarah remembered her first assignment in Afghanistan. When she was still learning the cultural complexities of the region, she had made a mistake during an interview, inadvertently asking questions that revealed too much about what she already knew. Her source, an elderly man named Hassan, had gently corrected her approach. Trust is like water in the desert, he had told her in careful English. It is precious and rare. Once spilled, it cannot be gathered again. At the time, Sarah had appreciated the wisdom but hadn't fully grasped its implications. Now, sitting in her concrete cell, she understood that her entire career had been built on that foundation of trust. Every successful operation, every piece of valuable intelligence, every life saved had depended on people believing that she would honor her commitments to them. The interrogators were asking her to spill that water in the desert. They wanted her to betray not just her sources but the fundamental principle that made ethical intelligence work possible. If she gave them what they wanted, she might secure her own freedom, but she would destroy something far more valuable. Sarah thought about her grandfather's stories from World War II. He had fought in the Pacific Theater, witnessing both the brutality of war and the courage of ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. He had told her about Filipino resistance fighters who had helped American forces, often paying for their assistance with their lives. The hardest thing about war, he had said, isn't facing the enemy. It's making sure you don't become the thing you're fighting against. Those words took on new meaning as Sarah contemplated her situation. She was fighting for the soul of the institution she loved, for the principles that made her service meaningful. The enemy wasn't just external threats. It was the corruption of values from within, the gradual erosion of the moral foundation that justified American power around the world. Her oath had prepared her for this moment, though she hadn't realized it at the time. She had promised to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sometimes that meant standing against foreign insurgents, but sometimes it meant standing against colleagues who had lost their way, against orders that violated fundamental principles, against systems that treated human dignity as expendable. As the days blended together in her cell, Sarah drew strength from the memory of everyone who had trusted her over the years. Their faces reminded her that her choice wasn't just about her own conscience. It was about honoring the sacrifices of people who had believed in something better. 2 months into her imprisonment, Sarah faced her darkest hour when they brought her real family to the facility. Unlike the actors they had used before, these were genuine voices from her past. Her younger brother David, her elderly mother, and her best friend from college, Jennifer. They were escorted into a small visitation room where Sarah sat shackled to a metal chair, her appearance shocking them into silence. Sarah had lost nearly 20 pounds during her confinement. Her uniform hung loosely on her diminished frame and dark circles surrounded her eyes. Her once proud military bearing had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for survival. "Sarah, honey, what have they done to you?" her mother whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. Margaret Mitchell had always been proud of her daughter's service, displaying Sarah's military awards prominently in their family home. Seeing her decorated daughter in shackles broke something inside the older woman. David, a high school teacher who had always looked up to his military sister, struggled to maintain his composure. "Sarah, they told us you're refusing to cooperate with a national security investigation. They said you could be charged with treason. Please, just tell them what they want to know. Whatever it is can't be worth this." Jennifer, now a successful lawyer in civilian life, had driven 12 hours to reach the facility. She studied Sarah's condition with professional concern. "Sarah, I've looked into your legal situation. If you're charged under the Espionage Act, you could face life in prison or worse. I can represent you, but you need to help yourself here." The guards allowed them only 30 minutes together, and every word was monitored and recorded. Sarah longed to explain her position, to help them understand why she couldn't simply give her interrogators what they wanted. But she couldn't discuss operational details with civilians, even family members, and any attempt to do so would only strengthen the case against her. "I can't discuss the specifics," Sarah said carefully, "but I need you to know that I'm doing what I believe is right. I took an oath to protect innocent people, and I can't break that oath no matter what it costs me." Her mother reached across the table, grasping Sarah's shackled hands. "But what about protecting yourself? What about your future? Your family needs you to come home." The weight of her family's pain was almost unbearable. Sarah could see how her imprisonment was affecting them. The sleepless nights and constant worry etched into their faces. David had taken leave from his teaching job to care for their mother, who had been struggling with anxiety and depression since learning of Sarah's situation. "I love you all more than anything," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But I can't live with myself if I betray people who trusted me with their lives. Some things are more important than personal survival." After they left, Sarah was returned to her cell in an even more isolated wing of the facility. The guards informed her that all future visitation privileges had been revoked as a security measure. She was now completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to know what was happening to the people she cared about. The interrogations intensified after the family visit. Her captors had clearly hoped that seeing her loved ones would break her resolve, and her continued resistance seemed to anger them. They began using more aggressive psychological tactics, including sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, and prolonged stress positions during questioning. "Your family thinks you're being stubborn and foolish. One interrogator told her during a session that lasted 18 hours. Your mother is having health problems because of the stress you're putting her through. Your brother might lose his job because of the investigation into your activities. Is protecting a bunch of foreigners really worth destroying your family? They showed her surveillance footage of her family home, her mother struggling to maintain her daily routines while dealing with constant anxiety. They played recordings of David trying to explain to his students why he needed to take extended leave. They shared transcripts of Jennifer's increasingly desperate attempts to find legal representation for Sarah's case. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and relentless. They brought in military psychologists who analyzed her personality profile and identified her deepest fears and strongest motivations. They understood that Sarah's greatest weakness was her love for others, and they used that love as a weapon against her. You're not just hurting yourself, a female interrogator explained in a tone of false sympathy. Every day you remain silent, more people suffer. Your family, your fellow soldiers who are being investigated because of their association with you, the missions that are being compromised because we can't properly debrief your sources. But the cruelest psychological pressure came when they began targeting her sense of military honor. They brought in former colleagues who testified that Sarah's refusal to cooperate was endangering ongoing operations. They claimed that intelligence networks were being rolled up because her sources couldn't be properly extracted or protected. You think you're being noble, Colonel Harrison told her during one particularly brutal session, but you're actually being selfish. Real soldiers sacrifice their personal feelings for the greater good. Real patriots put their country's needs above their own moral posturing. They presented her with fabricated evidence that her sources had already been compromised, claiming that her silence was pointless because the damage had already been done. They showed her photographs of alleged arrests and interrogations, though Sarah suspected many were staged or from unrelated incidents. The physical conditions continued to deteriorate. Her cell was kept deliberately uncomfortable, either too hot or too cold. The lighting was harsh and constant, making sleep nearly impossible. Her meals were reduced to the absolute minimum necessary for survival, leaving her constantly weak and disoriented. Medical care was withheld except for the most basic necessities. When Sarah developed a severe respiratory infection, she was given minimal treatment and told that better medical care would be available if she chose to cooperate. The message was clear. Her suffering would continue and intensify until she broke. During her 3rd month of imprisonment, Sarah experienced what felt like complete despair. Alone in her cell, weakened by malnutrition and sleep deprivation, she began to question whether her sacrifice had any meaning. Perhaps her interrogators were right. Perhaps she was being stubborn and self-righteous rather than principled and brave. She thought about the comfortable life she could have if she simply gave them the information they wanted. She could return to her family, resume her career, maybe even receive recognition for her cooperation. The names they wanted were just words on paper. The people behind those names were thousands of miles away, living lives she couldn't control or protect anyway. But even in her darkest moments, Sarah couldn't escape the faces that haunted her conscience. Every time she considered surrender, she remembered Fareed's granddaughter, a bright 10-year-old who dreamed of becoming a doctor. She thought about Amira's students, whose access to education depended on maintaining the delicate trust between their teacher and American forces. These people had believed in something better when they chose to work with Sarah. They had risked everything for the hope that their cooperation might help build a more peaceful future for their families and communities. How could she honor that sacrifice by betraying them to protect herself? The interrogators sensed her wavering resolve and pressed their advantage. They offered her increasingly attractive deals, reduced charges, protected testimony, guaranteed safety for her family. All she had to do was provide the information they needed, and her nightmare would end. "This is your last chance, Mitchell," one of them warned her. "We have other ways of getting this information, methods that won't be as clean or as protective of your precious sources. Your cooperation now might be the only thing that saves them." Sarah realized that this was her ultimate test. Everything she had endured had led to this moment, when surrender seemed not just appealing but rational. This was when her true character would be revealed, when she would discover whether her principles were stronger than her pain. In that moment of supreme temptation, Sarah found her answer in the memory of her oath. She had promised to defend something greater than herself even unto death. That promise wasn't conditional on the circumstances being convenient or the cost being bearable. It was absolute, demanding everything she had to give. On a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in her 14th week of imprisonment, Sarah heard unusual commotion in the corridors outside her cell. Heavy footsteps echoed through the concrete hallways, accompanied by sharp voices issuing rapid commands. The normal routine of the facility seemed disrupted, as if something significant was happening that the guards hadn't anticipated. Sarah was lying on her narrow cot, conserving energy as she had learned to do during her months of confinement, when her cell door opened with an unexpected urgency. Instead of the familiar faces of her regular guards, she saw a tall, imposing figure in military dress uniform standing in the doorway. Even in her weakened state, Sarah immediately recognized the insignia of a brigadier general. General Rebecca Torres was a legend in military intelligence circles, though Sarah had never met her personally. Torres had built her reputation over 30 years of service, known for her unwavering integrity and her fierce protection of intelligence personnel under her command. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her presence filled any space she occupied. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a perfect military bun, and her dark brown eyes seemed to take in every detail of Sarah's condition in a single glance. "Officer Mitchell," General Torres said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am General Torres, and I am here to conduct a personal review of your case." Behind her stood a team of military lawyers, investigators, and what appeared to be federal agents wearing different agency badges than the ones Sarah had become accustomed to seeing. The atmosphere was tense, as if competing forces were at work behind the scenes. "General, with respect," Colonel Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and his voice strained. "This prisoner is under our jurisdiction pending completion of our investigation. We weren't notified of any command review." General Torres turned to face Harrison with a look that could have frozen steel. "Colonel, this investigation is now under my direct oversight. Officer Mitchell will be transferred to proper military custody immediately." Sarah watched this exchange with growing confusion. After months of isolation and psychological pressure, she found it difficult to believe that anything was changing in her favor. The interrogators had used false hope as a torture technique before, and she couldn't allow herself to trust what she was seeing. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, her voice hoarse from weeks of minimal speaking, "I need to verify your identity and authority before I can acknowledge any change in my status." General Torres smiled for the first time, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the warmth behind her stern military demeanor. "Officer Mitchell, that is exactly the kind of caution I would expect from someone with your training and integrity. Sergeant Williams, please provide Officer Mitchell with my credentials and the authorization documents for this transfer." As Sarah examined the paperwork, General Torres continued speaking. "Officer Mitchell, I want you to know that your situation has come to my attention through channels that your previous interrogators were not aware of. There are aspects of this case that go far beyond what you have been told." The next hour unfolded like a military operation. Sarah was released from her shackles, given proper medical attention for the first time in months, and allowed to shower and change into a clean uniform. Throughout this process, General Torres remained present, overseeing every detail and ensuring that Sarah was treated with the dignity and respect due to a service member. As they prepared to leave the facility, General Torres walked beside Sarah's wheelchair, speaking in low tones that couldn't be overheard by the other personnel. "Officer Mitchell, I need you to understand that what happened to you here was not authorized by legitimate military command. This was a rogue operation conducted by individuals who exceeded their authority." Sarah felt a mix of relief and anger washing over her. "General, are you saying that my imprisonment was illegal?" "I'm saying that the people who imprisoned you were operating outside proper channels and without appropriate oversight. The intelligence they were trying to extract from you was not for any legitimate national security purpose." As they rode in a secure military transport away from the detention facility, General Torres began to explain the true nature of what Sarah had been caught up in. The two civilian interrogators who had demanded information about her sources were not government agents at all, but private contractors working for a defense company that had been hired to conduct unauthorized intelligence gathering. The company involved has contracts with multiple government agencies, General Torres explained. But this particular operation was entirely their own initiative. They were planning to sell your source information to the highest bidder, possibly including foreign governments or criminal organizations. Sarah felt sick as the implications became clear. You mean they wanted me to betray my sources so they could be exploited or eliminated by whoever paid the most? That appears to be the case. Your sources weren't just valuable for their intelligence. They were valuable as assets that could be turned, eliminated, or used to compromise other operations. Your refusal to cooperate prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach. The revelation that her imprisonment had been based on corruption rather than legitimate national security concerns was both validating and infuriating. Sarah had endured months of physical and psychological torture, had been separated from her family and threatened with treason charges, all so that private contractors could profit from betraying the people who had risked their lives to help American forces. How did you discover what was happening? Sarah asked. General Torres's expression hardened. One of your former colleagues, Captain Martinez, became suspicious when he noticed irregularities in how your case was being handled. He couldn't reach you through normal channels, and when he tried to verify the legal basis for your detention, he encountered obstruction and contradictory information. Captain Martinez had been Sarah's partner during her previous deployment in Iraq. He was a careful, methodical investigator who had worked closely with Sarah to develop and protect intelligence sources. When he learned about her imprisonment, he had begun his own quiet investigation into the circumstances. Martinez discovered that the civilian contractors had been using falsified federal credentials and had convinced Colonel Harrison that they were acting under classified orders from Washington. Harrison thought he was supporting a legitimate counterintelligence operation. The scope of the deception was staggering. The contractors had created an elaborate fiction, complete with forged documents and fake authorization codes, to convince military personnel that Sarah's detention was necessary for national security. They had exploited the classification system to prevent proper oversight, and had relied on the military's respect for authority to carry out their plan. What about Colonel Harrison? Sarah asked. Was he involved in the conspiracy? Harrison was a useful fool, General Torres replied bluntly. He was ambitious and eager to curry favor with what he thought were high-level intelligence officials. He didn't ask enough questions or demand proper verification because he wanted to be seen as cooperative and reliable. As they arrived at a proper military medical facility, Sarah learned that the investigation into her case had uncovered a much larger pattern of corruption. The private contractors had been operating similar schemes in multiple locations, exploiting the complexities of modern intelligence work to steal valuable information and sell it for profit. Your resistance broke their timeline, General Torres explained. They needed to extract and sell the information quickly to fulfill their contracts with buyers. When you refused to cooperate, they had to extend the operation, which gave us time to discover what was happening. Sarah was admitted to the medical facility for a full evaluation and treatment for the effects of her prolonged imprisonment. As doctors examined her physical condition and psychologists assessed her mental state, General Torres remained nearby, ensuring that Sarah received the best possible care. Officer Mitchell, the general said as Sarah settled into a clean hospital bed for the first time in months, I want you to know that your actions likely saved the lives of dozens of people and prevented significant damage to American intelligence operations. Your integrity under extreme pressure exemplifies the best traditions of military service. For the first time since her ordeal began, Sarah allowed herself to feel hope. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but she finally understood that her sacrifice had meaning, that her refusal to betray her principles had protected not just her sources, but the entire intelligence system they represented. What happens now? Sarah asked. General Torres' expression was serious but encouraging. Now we make sure that justice is served, both for you and for the people who tried to exploit your honor for their own profit. And we work to ensure that something like this never happens again. 6 months after her rescue from the illegal detention facility, Sarah stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., her testimony marking the conclusion of one of the largest military contractor fraud investigations in recent history. She wore her dress uniform with all her ribbons and medals properly displayed, a stark contrast to the weakened, shackled woman who had been pulled from her concrete cell. The recovery process had been long and difficult. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the military hospital, regaining the weight she had lost and receiving treatment for the physical effects of her imprisonment. The psychological healing took much longer, requiring months of counseling to help her process the trauma of her ordeal and the betrayal by the institution she had served faithfully. Her family had been reunited with her within days of her rescue. The reunion was emotional and healing, though it took time for them to understand the full scope of what she had endured and why her resistance had been so important. Her mother, Margaret, had aged years during Sarah's imprisonment, but seeing her daughter vindicated and honored helped restore her faith in the military system they had always respected. The investigation led by General Torres had uncovered a massive corruption network spanning multiple defense contractors and several military installations. The private company that had orchestrated Sarah's imprisonment was discovered to have been running similar operations at bases around the world, stealing intelligence information and selling it to foreign governments, criminal organizations, and competing corporations. The 2 fake federal agents who had interrogated Sarah were actually former intelligence officers who had been dishonorably discharged for ethics violations. They had used their knowledge of military procedures and their connections within the contractor community to create a sophisticated criminal enterprise. When arrested, they were found to be in possession of classified information from dozens of sources, much of it already sold to hostile foreign powers. Colonel Harrison faced a court-martial for his role in Sarah's illegal imprisonment. While the investigation concluded that he had been deceived rather than intentionally corrupt, his failure to properly verify the credentials and authority of the civilian contractors constituted a serious breach of his responsibilities. He was demoted and forced into early retirement. His military career ended in disgrace. The broader investigation revealed systemic weaknesses in how the military handled contractor relationships and oversight of intelligence operations. Sarah's case became a catalyst for significant reforms in military intelligence protocols, including new verification procedures for civilian contractor access and stronger protections for military personnel who reported suspected irregularities. As Sarah testified before Congress, she spoke not just about her own experience but about the broader implications of what had happened. The people who trusted me with their lives believed they were helping America uphold its values around the world, she said, her voice clear and strong despite the memories she was recounting. If we allow those relationships to be corrupted for profit, we betray not just our sources but everything our country claims to stand for. Her testimony was instrumental in passing new legislation, strengthening oversight of military contractors and creating new whistleblower protections for service members who reported suspected fraud or abuse. The Sarah Mitchell Act, as it came to be known, established clear procedures for investigating allegations of contractor misconduct and provided legal protection for military personnel who refused to participate in potentially illegal activities. The most gratifying outcome for Sarah was learning that her sources in Afghanistan had remained safe. General Torres had worked with international partners to verify the security of the people Sarah had protected, and in several cases, arrangements were made to relocate them and their families to safer locations. Fareed, the elderly shopkeeper whose information had helped save countless lives, was among those who were successfully evacuated to the United States along with his 7 grandchildren. Sarah received multiple military honors for her actions, including the Distinguished Service Medal and the Intelligence Star. But the recognition that meant the most to her came from her fellow intelligence officers, who understood the courage it had taken to resist pressure that could have destroyed both her life and the lives of innocent people. 3 years after her ordeal, Sarah was promoted to major and assigned to a new position overseeing intelligence ethics and contractor oversight at the Pentagon. Her experience had made her uniquely qualified to help prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. She worked with new officers, teaching them about the moral complexities of intelligence work and the importance of maintaining integrity, even under extreme pressure. The oath we take isn't just words, she would tell new intelligence trainees. It's a promise to be worthy of the trust that people place in us. That trust is sacred, and protecting it is more important than protecting ourselves. Sarah also became involved in supporting other military personnel who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct or refusing to participate in questionable activities. She worked with legal advocacy groups to strengthen protections for whistleblowers and helped establish support networks for service members who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The private contractor company that had orchestrated her imprisonment was completely dismantled. Its executives faced federal criminal charges for espionage, fraud, and conspiracy. Several received lengthy prison sentences, and the company was permanently barred from receiving any government contracts. The millions of dollars in illegal profits they had made were seized and used to compensate victims of their activities. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's case helped restore faith in the principle that individual conscience and moral courage still mattered in large institutional systems. Her story became part of military ethics training, studied as an example of how one person's integrity could protect not just immediate victims, but the broader values that made military service meaningful. 5 years after her imprisonment, Sarah married Captain Martinez, the colleague whose suspicions and investigation had ultimately led to her rescue. Their wedding was attended by many of the people whose lives had been touched by her courage, including several of the Afghan sources who had been safely relocated to the United States. In her wedding speech, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to that moment. "I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to immediate rewards," she said. "Sometimes it leads to suffering and doubt and fear. But in the end, being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that you kept faith with the people who trusted you is worth any price." Sarah continued her military career, eventually retiring as a colonel after 28 years of service. She went on to teach ethics at the Naval War College, where her courses became among the most popular and influential in the curriculum. Her story was featured in books and documentaries about military ethics and the importance of individual moral courage in institutional settings. But the legacy that mattered most to Sarah was the knowledge that her actions had protected innocent people and helped preserve the integrity of the intelligence relationships that were essential to American security around the world. The faces of her sources, the people who had trusted her with their lives, remained with her throughout her career, reminding her daily of why integrity and honor were not just ideals, but practical necessities for anyone entrusted with the lives and safety of others. Years later, when young officers asked her how she had found the strength to endure months of imprisonment, rather than betray her principles, Sarah's answer was always the same: "I didn't do it alone. I was sustained by the trust that good people had placed in me, and by the knowledge that some promises are too important to break, no matter what it costs to keep them." The little girl who had dreamed of serving her country with honor had become a woman who proved that individual conscience and moral courage could triumph over institutional corruption and personal adversity. Her story became a testament to the power of integrity and the importance of never betraying the trust of those who depend on us to do what is right.